Try not to embarrass us today, my daughter-in-law whispered as my husband's casket was carried into the chapel. I looked at her for a long moment, then nodded like I hadn't just been reduced to a problem that needed managing. The funeral home smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the kind of expensive quiet meant to make grief look dignified. Outside, cold October rain streaked down the stained glass windows, while black umbrellas moved slowly across the parking lot like shadows. Richard had always hated rainy funerals. Makes everybody look twice as miserable, he used to say whenever we drove past cemeteries during storms. Now here I was at 70 years old, standing beside the man I'd loved for 43 years, listening to my own family treat me like some fragile burden they needed to contain for the afternoon. Stacy adjusted the sleeve of her designer black coat and gave me that tight smile she wore around strangers, the one that never quite reached her eyes. The Bennetts from the country club are here, she murmured softly. And Michael's business partners. Let's keep things graceful. Graceful? I almost smiled at the irony. I had spent 4 decades building a graceful life beside Richard Carter. I had stood beside him when his construction company was nothing more than one pickup truck and a rented office above a hardware store. I had balanced invoices at our kitchen table at midnight while our son slept upstairs. I had stretched grocery money, hosted clients, ironed shirts before dawn, and smiled through every exhausting year that turned Richard Carter into a respected man in Charleston society. But now, apparently, my role had been reduced to staying quiet long enough not to inconvenience anyone. The chapel slowly filled with guests dressed in dark wool coats and expensive perfume. Men shook Michael's hand with solemn expressions while women hugged Stacy as though she were the widow instead of me. Every few minutes someone gave me the same pitying look people reserve for old dogs left behind after moving day. Poor Evelyn. Poor thing. I sat in the second row because Stacy informed me the front pew was reserved for immediate family. The words settled coldly in my chest. Immediate family. As though I had merely rented space in Richard's life all these years instead of sharing every inch of it. Claire noticed first. My granddaughter paused halfway down the aisle, confusion flickering across her face as she looked from the empty front row seat to where I sat alone near the back. "Grandma," she whispered quietly. Before I could answer, Stacy appeared beside her like smoke. "Sweetheart, sit up front with your parents," she said gently, steering the girl away before another word could be spoken. Claire glanced back at me over her shoulder, uncomfortable but obedient. The organ music began low and mournful. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at Richard's casket. Dark mahogany, silver handles. Exactly the one he once joked he'd never be caught dead in because it looked too flashy. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Grief came in strange waves. Not loud, not dramatic. Just sudden moments where the world felt wrong because one person no longer existed inside it. Halfway through the service, a funeral director leaned down beside me holding a leather folder against his chest. His voice was polite but hesitant. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "there seems to be an issue with the payment authorization for today's services." Heat crawled slowly into my face. "I'm sorry." He lowered his voice further. "The account listed for the funeral trust was closed yesterday morning. We were told your son would be handling any remaining balances." I turned slowly toward Michael seated 3 rows ahead beside Stacy. He didn't look back. Stacy, however, did. Her eyes met mine for half a second before drifting calmly away toward the minister at the podium. And suddenly I understood. They thought I was broke. They thought Richard had left me with nothing but old jewelry, fading memories, and a house too large for one elderly woman to maintain. That explained the whispers, the careful smiles, the way Stacy had spoken to me all week like someone preparing a child for disappointment. I looked down at my black gloves resting neatly in my lap. Richard used to tease me for always wearing gloves to formal events. "You dress like a first lady," he'd laugh. I could almost hear his voice now. Steady, calm, certain. And beneath the grief, beneath the humiliation sitting quietly in that chapel, something colder began settling into place inside me. Because Richard Carter had never been careless with money. And if the funeral account had been closed the day before his burial, then somebody already knew something I didn't. The rain had not stopped by the time I returned home that evening. Water slid slowly across the windshield as I pulled Richard's old Lincoln into the driveway. And for a moment I stayed inside the car with the engine running, staring at the dark windows of the house we had shared for more than 40 years. The porch light was off. Richard always left it on whenever I went somewhere after sunset. "A house should look like it is waiting for you," he used to say. That light had greeted me through snowstorms, long grocery trips, hospital visits, and every ordinary day in between. Seeing the porch dark now felt wrong in a way I could not explain. I stepped inside quietly, still wearing my funeral clothes. The air smelled faintly of furniture polish and lilies from the arrangements people had sent earlier that morning. Someone had already moved half the flowers into the dining room. Stacy probably thought the living room looked cluttered. My heels clicked softly across the hardwood floor as I walked toward the kitchen, but I stopped halfway there when I noticed something missing. Richard's coat rack beside the staircase was empty. Completely empty. The old brown raincoat he wore every winter was gone. So was the navy jacket Claire bought him 3 Christmases ago. Even his fishing hat had disappeared. I stood there staring at the bare hooks longer than I should have. Richard had only been dead 6 days. 6 days. Yet somehow parts of him were already being erased from the house, like chalk washed away by rain. I found Stacy in the kitchen opening bottles of sparkling water while Michael scrolled through his phone at the counter. Neither of them looked particularly tired from the funeral. Stacy glanced up first. "Oh, good. You are back," she said lightly. "Some people from the church may stop by tomorrow, so I started organizing a few things." I looked toward the garage door. "Where are Richard's coats?" Michael finally lifted his eyes from the screen. "We donated some clothes this afternoon, Mom." The sentence landed softly, almost casually. That somehow made it worse. "Donated," I repeated quietly. Stacy gave a small shrug. There was no reason to keep everything sitting around collecting dust. Collecting dust. I pressed my fingertips against the cold marble edge of the kitchen island to steady myself. Richard had worn that brown raincoat every fall since 1998. Claire used to joke that she would bury him in it one day because he refused to buy another one. And now strangers somewhere would unzip those pockets without ever knowing the man who once carried peppermints there for his granddaughter every Sunday after church. Michael cleared his throat awkwardly. "We are just trying to help simplify things for you." Simplify. Another careful word. Another sentence polished smooth enough to hide the cruelty underneath it. I nodded once because I suddenly understood something important. They were already preparing me for downsizing. Smaller house. Smaller life. Smaller place inside the family. Stacy twisted the cap onto a bottle of water and leaned against the counter. "Actually," she added carefully, "Michael and I were thinking maybe it is time to discuss long-term plans for the property." Property. Not home. Not your house. Property. Richard built this place himself room by room over 11 years. I still remembered him measuring window frames with sawdust on his boots while Michael rode his bicycle in circles across the unfinished driveway. I remembered painting nursery walls at midnight because we could not afford contractors back then. Every inch of this house carried fingerprints from a life they now spoke about like a business transaction. "Not tonight," I said softly. Stacy smiled politely, but disappointment flashed across her face before she could hide it. Michael returned to staring at his phone. The silence around us felt crowded somehow. I excused myself and walked upstairs slowly, one hand resting against the banister. Richard had carved himself decades ago. Our bedroom door was slightly open. Inside, the bed had already been made differently. The decorative pillows Stacy loved were arranged neatly against my headboard. My headboard. Richard used to laugh every time I complained about those useless pillows. "Too many cushions," he would grumble before tossing them onto the floor every night. I sat carefully on the edge of the mattress and looked toward Richard's side of the room. His reading glasses were gone from the nightstand. So was his watch. Only the pale square where the lamp used to sit remained untouched. My chest tightened. I opened the drawer beside the bed where Richard kept important papers, hoping to find something familiar, something untouched by everyone else's hands. The drawer was nearly empty except for an old receipt and a hotel pen. Slowly, I stood and crossed the room toward the small painting hanging beside the bookshelf. Behind it was the wall safe Richard installed years ago after a break-in down the street. He once told me only 3 people knew the combination. Him, me, and Michael. My fingers trembled slightly as I entered the code. The metal door clicked open. Empty. Completely empty. Not one document remained inside. I did not sleep that night. The house made unfamiliar sounds after midnight. the kind that only appear once someone important is gone. Pipes shifting inside the walls. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Rain tapping softly against the bedroom windows. Richard used to sleep heavily beside me through storms while I lay awake listening to the weather move across the roof. Every now and then he would reach for my hand in his sleep without even opening his eyes, as though some part of him needed reassurance I was still there. Around 2 in the morning, I walked downstairs in my robe and found the dining room lights glowing softly beneath the chandelier. Stacy sat alone at the table with her laptop open beside a stack of folders. She looked startled when she noticed me standing in the doorway. "You are still awake?" she asked quickly, closing one of the folders halfway. "So are you," I replied. Her smile appeared a second too late. "I was organizing paperwork from the funeral." I nodded slowly and poured myself a glass of water from the kitchen sink. The coldness steadied me. "You seem very interested in paperwork lately." Stacy crossed one leg over the other carefully. "Someone has to keep things moving forward." There it was again, that quiet impatience beneath her polished voice, as though grief itself had become an inconvenience delaying more important business. I carried the glass toward the dining room and noticed one document partially visible beneath her laptop. Property valuation estimates. The numbers were large enough to catch my attention even upside down. She followed my eyes immediately and closed the folder completely. "Michael worries about you staying here alone," she said. "This house is a lot for someone your age." Someone your age. I almost laughed. 6 months earlier, I had climbed onto the roof beside Richard because the gutter installers failed to secure part of the drainage system correctly. I still drove myself downtown. Still balanced my own accounts. Still volunteered twice a week at St. Matthew's food pantry. But grief had aged me in their eyes overnight. Widowhood had apparently transformed me into fragile furniture. "I managed this house before you ever stepped inside it," I said quietly. Stacy tilted her head sympathetically, a gesture practiced enough to seem almost rehearsed. Of course, nobody is questioning that. But they were. Every conversation now carried the same invisible message underneath it. What will happen to Evelyn? Where will Evelyn go? How expensive will Evelyn become? I excused myself without another word and carried my water upstairs. Halfway down the hallway, I noticed lights spilling beneath the door of Richard's study. Michael stood inside, near the bookshelf with his back turned toward me. He quickly closed a drawer when he heard my footsteps. "Mom," he said, startled. "I thought you went to bed." I looked at the open cabinet beside him. Richard's whiskey collection had already been boxed up. Empty spaces lined the shelves where framed photographs once stood. "What are you doing in here?" Michael rubbed the back of his neck nervously. It was a habit he had since childhood whenever he lied about something small. Broken lamps. Missed curfews. Report cards hidden at the bottom of backpacks. "Just sorting things out," he muttered. Sorting things out. Everyone in this house seemed eager to erase Richard before the ground above him had even settled. My eyes drifted toward the desk. Richard's leather planner was missing too. He carried that planner everywhere. Appointments. Phone numbers. Notes written in the margins nobody else could decipher. He once joked the thing contained his entire life. "Where is your father's planner?" I asked calmly. Michael hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "I think Harold Bennett took some documents earlier this week." Harold, Richard's attorney. The answer settled strangely in my chest because Harold never removed original materials without informing both of us first. Richard trusted very few people completely, but Harold Bennett was one of them. Did Harold say why? Michael looked away. Something about updating files. Updating files. At midnight, 3 days before the funeral, I studied my son carefully beneath the warm light of Richard's study lamp. He looked exhausted, but not from grief. His exhaustion carried tension beneath it. Restlessness. Calculation. And suddenly I realized something that hurt far worse than the missing papers or empty safe. Michael was afraid. Not of losing his father. Of something else entirely. Downstairs, I heard Stacy laugh softly at something on her phone. The sound floated up through the hallway sharp and out of place inside a mourning house. Michael closed another drawer quickly. "You should get some rest, Mom," he said. I looked once more around Richard's study. The shelves. The desk. The empty spaces where pieces of him had quietly disappeared all week long. Then I noticed one thing nobody else had touched. On the corner of the bookshelf sat the small bronze compass Richard kept since his Navy days. He used to say a man should always leave himself a way to find true north again when people around him started losing direction. I picked it up carefully and slipped it into my robe pocket before leaving the room. Michael watched me the entire time without saying a word. The next morning, the house smelled like burnt coffee and fresh printer ink. Stacy was already awake by 6:30, sitting at the kitchen island in cream-colored cashmere while scrolling through real estate listings on her tablet. She looked less like a grieving daughter-in-law and more like a woman preparing for a business meeting. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows above the sink, pale and cold after 2 straight days of rain. Richard used to stand there every morning reading the newspaper with his reading glasses low on his nose while humming old Frank Sinatra songs under his breath. I could still picture the steam rising from his coffee mug beside the toaster. Strange how memories stayed alive in objects long after people disappeared. Stacy glanced up briefly as I entered the kitchen. "There is yogurt in the refrigerator if you want breakfast," she said without looking away from the screen. "Not good morning. Not how did you sleep. Just yogurt." I poured myself coffee instead and sat across from her quietly. Her tablet reflected in the polished marble countertop. Oceanfront condos. Luxury retirement communities. Maintenance-free living for active seniors. I stirred cream slowly into my cup. "Looking for something?" Stacy locked the screen immediately. "Just helping Michael research options for the future." Future. Another word that sounded harmless until she used it. "Your generation always wants less responsibility," I said softly. She smiled politely. "Your generation held on to things too long." I nodded once because arguing with Stacy never sounded like arguing. It sounded like being wrapped slowly in silk until you realized you could no longer breathe. Michael entered the kitchen 10 minutes later wearing golf clothes despite having no golf game scheduled. I knew because Richard kept the family calendar on the refrigerator for years, and Michael never removed old habits entirely. He kissed Stacy on the cheek, then paused awkwardly when he noticed me sitting there. "Morning, Mom." His voice carried guilt beneath it now. I could hear it more clearly every day. "Morning," I replied. Stacy closed her tablet carefully. Michael was thinking maybe today would be a good time to start organizing some financial documents. There it was again, always circling back to money, to papers, to ownership. Michael rubbed his jaw tiredly. "Just so everything stays simple." Simple. Richard's life had apparently become paperwork people needed processed before the month ended. I took a slow sip of coffee and watched them both over the rim of the mug. Young couples always believed older people stopped noticing things after a certain age. But age sharpened observation in strange ways. You stopped wasting energy on noise and started paying attention to patterns instead. And patterns were beginning to appear everywhere around me. Stacy speaking before Michael answered questions. Michael avoiding eye contact whenever finances came up. Missing documents. Empty drawers. Quiet pressure about selling the house before the will had even been formally read. My eyes drifted toward the refrigerator where family photographs still hung beneath alphabet magnets Claire placed there years ago. One picture caught my attention immediately. Richard and me standing beside the company sign the day Carter Construction opened its new headquarters downtown. I remembered that day clearly. Richard wore the same navy suit Michael buried him in last week. We looked exhausted and proud all at once. "You know," I said calmly, "people always assumed your father built the business alone." Michael shifted uncomfortably. Stacy stayed silent. "But Richard hated bookkeeping," I continued. "He used to joke that if I died first, the Internal Revenue Service would probably arrest him within 6 months." Michael gave a weak smile out of obligation more than amusement. Stacy folded her hands neatly together. "Nobody doubts how much you supported him." Supported him. Another carefully chosen phrase reducing 40 years of partnership into background decoration. I stood slowly and carried my coffee cup toward the sink. "I did not support Richard," I said quietly. "I built that company beside him." The kitchen fell silent. I rinsed the cup carefully beneath warm water while memories surfaced one after another. Me. Driving payroll checks across town in a thunderstorm because employees needed to be paid before Christmas. Me balancing accounts at the dining room table while Richard slept 3 hours a night trying to save contracts during the recession. Me catching an accounting error years ago that nearly cost the company $500,000. Stacy had entered the family long after success arrived polished and comfortable. She knew the rewards. She never saw the sacrifice underneath them. The phone rang suddenly beside the stove. Stacy reached for it first, but froze when she saw the caller identification. Harold Bennett. For the first time all morning, real tension crossed her face. Michael noticed it too. He answered quickly and turned slightly away from me while listening. His shoulders stiffened almost immediately. "Today?" he asked quietly. "I thought that was scheduled for next week." I watched him carefully as color slowly drained from his face. Across the room, Stacy stood completely still. Michael finally hung up and looked toward me with an expression I had not seen since he was a little boy caught doing something wrong. "Harold wants everyone at his office tomorrow morning," he said. "Apparently there are issues regarding the estate that need to be addressed immediately." Stacy's jaw tightened almost invisibly. I said nothing at all. I simply dried my coffee cup and placed it back exactly where Richard liked it for 43 years. Harold Bennett's office overlooked the Charleston Harbor from the top floor of an old brick building downtown. Richard loved that office because the windows faced east, and every morning sunlight poured across the conference table by 9 o'clock sharp. "Makes difficult conversations feel less ugly," he once told me after signing a contract there years ago. The morning of the estate meeting, however, the sky was gray again. Thick clouds pressed low over the water while gulls drifted above the marina below like scraps of paper caught in the wind. Stacy arrived 20 minutes early wearing pearl earrings and a cream blazer that looked far too elegant for a family still officially in mourning. Michael walked beside her carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. He barely spoke during the drive downtown. Every red light seemed to tighten something inside him further. Harold's receptionist greeted us quietly and led everyone into the conference room, where coffee already waited beside a silver tray of pastries nobody touched. I noticed immediately that Harold himself was not smiling. He had known Richard since college. Over 40 years. I had seen him laugh at barbecues, fishing trips, Christmas parties, and anniversary dinners. But this morning his face looked carved from stone. "Evelyn," he said softly as I entered, standing to pull out my chair himself. Not one person else in the room had done that for me all week. Stacy sat directly across from me and folded her hands neatly on top of the polished table. Michael stayed beside her, restless and pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Harold opened a thick folder slowly. "Before we begin," he said carefully, "there are several matters regarding Richard's final estate directives that require clarification." "Directives?" The word shifted the atmosphere in the room immediately. Stacy straightened slightly. Michael lowered his eyes toward the table. I sat quietly with my gloves folded in my lap and watched Harold remove a second envelope from the folder. Cream-colored, sealed with Richard's initials pressed into dark blue wax. My stomach tightened unexpectedly. I recognized the stationery immediately. Richard only used that paper for personal letters. Harold looked directly at me. "Richard requested this document remain sealed until after the funeral." Stacy's expression flickered for the first time. Just a small movement around her mouth, but enough for me to notice. Harold continued speaking calmly. "He amended portions of his estate approximately 6 months ago." 6 months. Around the same time Richard started waking up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep. Around the same time, he became unusually quiet during family dinners whenever Stacy discussed investments or property values. I remembered once asking if something was wrong. Meant his health. Now I wondered if he meant his family. Harold slid several papers across the table. Michael stared at them without touching anything. Stacy reached first. Her fingernails looked perfectly polished against the legal documents. "I thought Richard's will was finalized years ago," she said carefully. Harold nodded once. "Most of it was. However, he added a supplemental clause concerning asset protection and family conduct." The room became very still after that sentence. Even the faint humming sound from the air conditioner seemed louder somehow. Stacy leaned back slowly. "Family conduct?" she repeated with a small laugh that sounded too light for the room. Harold did not return the smile. Richard was very specific. He adjusted his glasses and opened another page. "In the event that Mrs. Evelyn Carter experienced coercion, intimidation, pressure regarding relocation, forced liquidation of property, or deliberate emotional mistreatment following his death, several inheritance structures would immediately change." Michael finally looked up sharply. Stacy's face lost color so gradually it almost seemed unreal. I sat motionless, listening carefully while my heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. Because suddenly everything made sense. The missing documents. The pressure about the house. The closed funeral account. Richard had known. Somehow, before he died, Richard had seen exactly what would happen after he was gone. Harold continued reading quietly while rain streaked across the harbor windows behind him. Primary ownership of all residential properties, investment accounts, and controlling shares of Carter Construction shall remain exclusively with my wife, Evelyn Carter. Stacy inhaled sharply. Michael closed his eyes briefly, like someone bracing for impact. But Harold was not finished. Furthermore, he said calmly, any beneficiary found attempting manipulation, concealment of estate materials, or financial interference prior to formal probate completion will forfeit individual inheritance rights entirely. Silence settled across the conference room, so heavily it almost felt physical. I looked down slowly at my wedding ring resting against the dark leather gloves in my lap. Richard once told me the most dangerous thing about quiet people was that others often mistook silence for weakness. Across the table, Stacy finally spoke again, though her voice sounded thinner now. Surely there is some misunderstanding. Harold met her eyes evenly. No, Mrs. Carter. There is not. Then he reached into the folder one final time and removed a small black flash drive, placing it carefully in the center of the table. Richard also left a private recorded statement, he said quietly. And after everything I have witnessed this week, I believe it is time everyone heard it. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Harold placed the flash drive on the conference table. Rain drifted against the harbor windows in soft gray streaks, while distant boat horns echoed faintly from the marina below. Stacy stared at the drive as though it might explode if touched. Michael looked sick. Truly sick. Not angry. Not defensive. Just frightened in the quiet way grown men become frightened when they realize consequences are finally catching up to them. Harold folded his hands calmly. Richard instructed me to play the recording only if I believed Evelyn was being mistreated after his passing. Stacy straightened immediately. Mistreated is a very dramatic word. Her voice regained some of its polish now, though I noticed she kept adjusting the pearl bracelet on her wrist repeatedly. We have only been trying to help Evelyn manage a difficult transition. Harold did not answer right away. He simply opened a legal folder and removed several printed bank statements. Then perhaps you can explain why $270,000 were transferred from a joint holding account 3 days before Richard died. Michael froze beside her. Stacy's mouth parted slightly before closing again. The silence that followed told me more than any confession could have. Harold slid the documents across the table toward me. Hospitalized. My fingers rested lightly against the paper while memories moved slowly through my mind. Richard sitting quietly in his hospital chair one evening asking for his laptop. Richard becoming strangely protective over certain financial documents during the final months of his illness. Richard telling me once, almost absent-mindedly, people reveal themselves very quickly around money. Across the table, Stacy finally inhaled sharply. Richard approved those transfers, she said carefully. Michael and I were helping reorganize investment structures for tax purposes. Harold looked at Michael. Is that your understanding as well? Michael swallowed hard before answering. Dad said it was temporary. Temporary. Hardened almost invisibly. I was trying to help this family move forward. No, I replied calmly. You were trying to move faster than the paperwork. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Harold remained silent, allowing the truth hanging in the room to settle naturally on its own weight. Outside, the rain finally began easing across the harbor. Thin streaks of sunlight pushed weakly through the clouds, casting pale reflections against the conference table. Harold reached for the flash drive again. There is one more matter, he said. Stacy sat perfectly still now. Richard amended his estate because he feared coercion against Evelyn after his death. However, he also included additional instructions regarding occupancy of the Carter residence. Michael looked up sharply. Occupancy. Harold nodded once. The property legally belongs solely to Evelyn. Furthermore, Richard specified that any family member residing there without her direct written permission must vacate immediately upon probate activation. Stacy's face drained completely of color this time. Michael stared at Harold in disbelief. I understood the meaning instantly. Richard had anticipated everything. The pressure, the manipulation, even the assumption that they would gradually take control of the house before legal matters finalized. Harold slid a single key across the table toward me. Small. Brass. Familiar. Richard asked me to return this to you personally, he said quietly. My throat tightened unexpectedly when I recognized it. The spare key to the private lockbox Richard rented downtown years ago. I had forgotten it even existed. Harold lowered his voice slightly. He told me if things ever became difficult after his passing, you would know exactly where to go. I closed my fingers slowly around the key, while Stacy stared at it with open panic. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized something important. My husband had not left me unprotected. He had left me prepared. The lockbox sat inside the oldest bank building in downtown Charleston, 3 blocks from the harbor and half hidden behind a row of magnolia trees shedding yellow leaves onto the sidewalk. Richard opened the account nearly 15 years earlier after a contractor sued the company over a dispute that never made it to court. Every smart man keeps one place nobody else touches, he told me afterward, while locking important documents inside a plain manila envelope. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now, walking through the marble lobby alone with his brass key in my coat pocket, I understood he had been planning for storms long before I noticed clouds gathering. The bank manager recognized me immediately and offered condolences in the careful voice people use around fresh grief. 10 minutes later, I sat alone inside a small private viewing room while a gray metal box rested open in front of me beneath soft fluorescent light. Inside were 3 folders, a velvet jewelry pouch, and a handwritten letter addressed simply, Evelyn. My fingertips trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. Richard's handwriting slanted sharply to the right, just as it always had. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then things unfolded exactly the way I feared they would. I stopped there for a moment because the sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because it surprised me anymore, but because Richard had carried this fear quietly while I still believed our family was safe. I continued reading slowly. I know you will try to excuse everyone at first. That is who you are. But I need you to see people clearly now, not lovingly. There are copies here of every transfer, every account adjustment, and every conversation I documented after I began suspecting financial manipulation. Harold has originals. You have proof. Do not let guilt make you weak. I lowered the letter carefully and stared at the room around me. Outside the frosted glass door, distant footsteps echoed faintly through the bank hallway. Richard had known. Not guessed. Known. I opened the first folder next. Bank records. Printed emails. Screenshots of wire transfers. Notes written in Richard's handwriting beside certain transactions. One note caught my eye immediately. Stacy pressured Michael again tonight about the house. Believes Evelyn will not understand probate structure. Another line underneath it read, Michael still thinks this can be fixed quietly. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Even now, seeing the evidence in front of me, part of me wanted to believe my son had simply been weak instead of dishonest. Weakness felt easier to survive than betrayal. I opened the second folder. Inside sat copies of company ownership structures for Carter Construction. My name appeared beside Richard's on almost every major document. Equal voting authority. Joint controlling interest. Stacy had spent years treating me like an aging widow who depended entirely on her husband's generosity while never realizing half the empire she admired legally belonged to me already. I almost smiled at the irony. The third folder contained something else entirely. Printed photographs. Family dinners. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. Claire sitting beside Richard at the lake house dock, holding a fishing pole nearly bigger than she was. Me dancing barefoot with Richard in the kitchen one anniversary, while Michael laughed behind us holding a camcorder. At first I did not understand why Richard placed them there until I noticed the final photograph underneath the stack. Stacy standing in our dining room 6 months earlier, speaking sharply while she thought nobody could hear her. Richard had taken the photo from the hallway mirror reflection. On the back, he wrote one sentence. She only respects what she can take. I sat there for a long time after that with the photograph resting quietly in my hands. Not crying. Not angry. Just tired in a way sleep could never repair. Eventually, I returned everything carefully to the folders except Richard's letter, which I folded into my purse beside the bronze compass from his study. When I walked back into the afternoon sunlight, Charleston looked strangely unchanged. Tourists carried shopping bags along King Street. Waiters arranged outdoor tables for lunch crowds. Traffic lights blinked lazily above wet pavement still drying after yesterday's rain. The world moved forward exactly as it always did. Grief never stopped cities from functioning. My phone rang while I stood near the curb waiting for the valet to bring my car around. Michael's name appeared across the screen. I considered letting it ring out. Instead, I answered calmly. "Mom," he said immediately, voice tight with panic. "Where are you?" "Downtown." Silence stretched briefly between us. "Harold called again," he said quietly. "There is going to be another meeting tonight at the house." I glanced toward the harbor where sunlight shimmered weakly across gray water. "Why?" Michael hesitated too long. "Because Stacy found out the account transfers might trigger a fraud investigation during probate review." There was at last. Not concern for me. Not grief for Richard. Fear. Pure fear. A black sedan pulled to the curb in front of me. The valet stepped out holding my keys. "Michael," I said softly before opening the car door. "Your father spent 43 years teaching people not to mistake kindness for blindness." Then I hung up before he could answer. By the time I returned to the house that evening, the sky over Charleston had turned the color of wet cement. Lights glowed through the front windows, and 3 unfamiliar luxury cars sat parked along the circular driveway beneath the oak trees. Stacy always invited people when she wanted witnesses. Richard noticed that years ago. Some folks collect allies the same way others collect jewelry. He once whispered to me during one of her elaborate dinner parties. Inside, the dining room had been transformed into something polished and artificial. Candles flickered along the center of the table beside untouched trays of catered food. Stacy stood near the fireplace, speaking softly with a man from Michael's accounting firm, while Michael paced beside the staircase with his phone pressed against his ear. The moment he saw me enter, he ended the call immediately. "Mom," he said quickly, walking toward me. "Can we talk privately?" I removed my gloves slowly and placed them on the entry table beside the silver bowl Richard always used for his keys. "If it concerns your father's estate," I replied calmly. "I prefer conversations where everyone hears the same truth." Michael's shoulders tightened. Across the room, Stacy dismissed the accountant with a thin smile before approaching us carefully. "Nobody is trying to fight with you, Evelyn," she said softly. "We are all under stress." I looked around the room quietly. Crystal glasses, expensive wine breathing beside untouched plates, low instrumental music drifting from ceiling speakers. The performance of family unity had already begun. "Interesting choice for a legal crisis," I said. Stacy's expression stiffened almost invisibly. "We thought a calm atmosphere would help everyone communicate maturely." Maturely. Another polished word covering panic underneath it. Claire sat alone near the far end of the dining room, scrolling absently through her phone. Unlike her parents, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. When our eyes met, she stood immediately and crossed the room toward me. "Grandma," she said softly before hugging me tightly. The gesture surprised me enough that I nearly lost composure for a moment. Nobody else in this house had touched me with simple affection since Richard died. "You look tired," she whispered. "I am," I admitted quietly. Claire glanced nervously toward her parents before lowering her voice further. "Dad and Mom have been arguing since the meeting this morning." I nodded once. None of that surprised me anymore. Fear always turns elegant people into careless ones eventually. Michael poured himself a drink with shaking hands while Stacy remained perfectly controlled near the fireplace. She wore pale gray silk tonight instead of morning black. Deliberate. Symbolic. Already transitioning the household away from grief and toward recovery. Recovery looked easier when wealth remained secure. Except now it was not secure at all. The front doorbell rang sharply through the house. Everyone froze slightly. Michael looked toward Stacy. Stacy looked toward the hallway. Then Harold Bennett entered carrying a slim leather briefcase beneath one arm. No greeting. No unnecessary politeness. Just business. "Thank you for gathering tonight," he said evenly. "I believe several misunderstandings require immediate resolution before probate proceedings continue." Stacy forced a smile. "Of course. We all want transparency." Harold's eyes rested on her for half a second too long. "Good," he replied. "Because Richard documented more than anyone realized." Silence settled over the dining room instantly. Michael lowered his drink without taking another sip. Harold placed the briefcase on the dining table and removed several folders alongside a small portable media player. Claire stared at it nervously. I recognized the flash drive immediately. Richard's final recording. Stacy crossed her arms carefully. Is this really necessary tonight? Harold did not answer immediately. Instead, he connected the device to the television mounted above the fireplace. The black screen reflected all our faces back at us for a brief moment before flickering to life. Then Richard appeared. My breath caught before I could stop it. He sat in his study wearing the navy cardigan Claire bought him last Christmas. The bookshelf behind him looked exactly as I remembered before half its contents mysteriously vanished after his death. Richard looked thinner in the recording than I remembered, but his eyes remained sharp and steady. Alive. If you are watching this, he began calmly, then I am no longer here to protect Evelyn myself. Nobody moved. Even Stacy seemed unable to look away. Richard folded his hands together slowly. I spent most of my life believing loyalty inside a family should never need legal protection, he continued. Turns out I was wrong. Michael lowered his head immediately. Stacy's jaw tightened hard enough for the muscle beneath her cheek to twitch. Richard looked directly into the camera then, and for one impossible second it felt as though he were speaking into the room itself. If anyone has treated my wife like a burden, a financial obstacle, or an inconvenience after my death, understand something clearly. Evelyn Carter stood beside me before there was money, before there were houses, before there was status worth inheriting. My throat tightened painfully. Richard's voice remained calm. Everything valuable in my life exists because of that woman. Across the room, Claire quietly wiped tears from beneath her eyes. Michael stared at the floor like a man shrinking inside his own skin. But Stacy still sat perfectly still beside the fireplace, trying desperately to preserve dignity even while the foundation beneath her carefully constructed world cracked apart piece by piece. Then Richard said the one sentence that changed the entire room forever. And if any of you mistook Evelyn's kindness for weakness, he said quietly, then you never understood who truly built this family. The room remained silent long after Richard's recording ended. The television screen faded to black again, reflecting all of us back in cold, distorted shapes beneath the soft dining room lights. Nobody reached for food. Nobody touched the wine. Even the candles along the center of the table had begun burning lower, their wax pooling quietly onto silver trays while the house settled around us with small creaks inside the walls. Claire was the first person to move. She crossed the room slowly and sat beside me without saying a word, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. I rested one hand gently over hers. Across from us, Michael still stared down at the hardwood floor like a man searching for something he had lost years ago and only just realized mattered. Stacy remained near the fireplace, though the confidence she wore so carefully all week had finally disappeared. For the first time since Richard died, she looked ordinary. Tired. Cornered. Human. Harold closed his briefcase quietly. Probate proceedings will continue through my office beginning Monday morning, he said evenly. Until then, all account access remains frozen pending review. Stacy inhaled sharply. Frozen? Harold nodded once. Including the transferred funds. Her composure cracked completely then. This is ridiculous, she snapped, the sharpness finally slipping free beneath all her polished manners. Richard was sick. He was paranoid near the end. Michael looked up immediately. Stop, he said quietly. Stacy turned toward him in disbelief. Michael, do not start acting innocent now. The sentence landed heavily between them. Years of quiet resentment suddenly visible all at once beneath expensive clothes and carefully maintained smiles. Michael stood slowly from his chair. Dad trusted Mom, he said, voice rough with exhaustion. And we treated her like she was in the way. Stacy laughed once under her breath, bitter and disbelieving. We were trying to protect our future. No, Michael answered quietly. You were. The silence after that felt strangely peaceful to me. Not because I enjoyed watching my family fracture. I did not. But because truth finally sat in the open where nobody could rearrange it anymore. Harold gathered the remaining papers calmly before walking toward me. Evelyn, he said softly. Richard also included one final instruction unrelated to the estate itself. I looked up at him. What instruction? A faint smile touched the corners of his tired face. He asked that you not spend the rest of your life managing everyone else's guilt. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Richard always knew exactly where to place the knife when honesty was necessary. Harold squeezed my shoulder gently before leaving the room. One by one, the others drifted away after that. The accountant disappeared first. Then Stacy quietly excused herself upstairs without another word. Michael lingered near the staircase, looking older than I had ever seen him. Claire stayed beside me the entire time. Eventually, Michael walked toward us slowly. "Mom," he said quietly. I looked up. His eyes were red now, though I could not tell whether from grief, shame, or exhaustion. Perhaps all three. "I should have stopped this sooner," he admitted. "I kept telling myself things would calm down after Dad passed, but everything just kept getting worse." I listened without interrupting. Age teaches you some apologies matter more when silence surrounds them. Michael swallowed hard. "I do not expect forgiveness right now." "Good," I replied softly. "Because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing." He nodded once, accepting the truth of it. Then, after a long pause, he quietly asked, "What happens now?" I looked around the dining room slowly. The flowers, the candles, Richard's empty chair at the far end of the table where he always carved Thanksgiving turkey every November for more than 40 years. Grief still lived inside every corner of this house. But for the first time since his death, fear no longer did. "Now," I said calmly, "people live with the choices they made." Later that night, after everyone finally went upstairs, I remained alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands. Rain had started again outside, soft against the windows above the sink. I could almost hear Richard humming somewhere down the hallway the way he always did before bed. I reached into my purse and unfolded his letter one final time beneath the warm kitchen light. "Do not let guilt make you weak." I smiled sadly to myself. For most of my life, I believed strength meant enduring everything quietly, keeping peace, absorbing hurt so the family stayed whole. But sitting there alone in the house Richard and I built together, I finally understood something different. Strength was not staying where people diminished you. Strength was surviving long enough to see people clearly and still refusing to become cruel yourself. 3 months later, Stacy moved out quietly after the probate investigation finalized. Michael rented an apartment downtown and started attending therapy twice a week. Claire began visiting every Sunday afternoon, usually bringing lemon pastries from the little bakery Richard loved near the marina. And me? I kept the house exactly as it was. Richard's coats returned to the hallway rack. His compass stayed beside my bed. Some evenings I still sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees while Charleston settled softly into twilight around me. People assumed losing Richard would leave me powerless. What they never understood was that grief does not always destroy a woman. Sometimes it finally introduces her to herself.